Hello everybody and welcome to freshcatholic.com. I'm Charles Merritt, and before we get started with what we're going to talk about this particular time, a couple of housekeeping items, as I like to say. A review for those of you that are already subscribers or followers or kind of check the website regularly, and maybe some general background information if you just stumbled in for the first time. But for the past, and I'm kind of looking at Simon here, 9-10 months, I've had the good fortune to be able to collaborate with freshcatholic.com, and my collaboration has kind of come in 4 different forms. I like to call them tracks. One track is I teach theology courses of multiple episodes. That would be one track. The second track is a Bible study track, of which we've done one 21 episode study on the Gospel of Mark. A third track are what we call one-offs, where I do a single episode on a single topic. And then the fourth track, I've kind of been a guest in Lori's Monday podcasts for I think 4 different times. So I've done 6 or 7 theology courses, 1 Bible study, 2 one-offs, and 4 guest appearances on Monday podcasts. So that's the different forms that my collaboration with Fresh Catholic has taken the past 9-10 months. The reason I mention that is what we're about to embark on now comes under the category of one-offs. Single episode on a single topic. However, for this one-off, we're going to tweak that a little bit, and it's going to be a single topic, but we're going to split it up into 2 episodes, a part 1 and a part 2. Reason being, and kind of compiling all the material and kind of eyeballing it in terms of delivering it, there was a couple of options. Number one, option 1 would be to fit it into a very long single episode, which we didn't like doing because we'd like to bring these episodes in around the 40-45 minute mark. So we really didn't want to do that. Option number 2 was to keep it as a single episode, but for me to talk very, very fast, and that would be very, very hard for you to understand, obviously, so we didn't want to do that. So we figured, okay, we'll split it into 2 episodes. So this is a one-off, but it's a one-off with 2 episodes. So with that said, let's dive into our topic. Now, December 24th, 2024, last Christmas Eve. While many of us were with family and friends, maybe having Christmas Eve dinner, opening up that one Christmas present in anticipation of Christmas morning, maybe we were at the Christmas Vigil Mass or the Children's Mass or maybe Midnight Mass, but whatever we may have been doing, December 24th, 2024, last Christmas Eve, something monumental happened. Something that happens, generally speaking, only 3, maybe 4 times in one's lifetime. And if you're thinking back to Christmas Eve and you're saying, something monumental happened? I guess I must have missed that. That's why we're doing this 2 episode one-off, to bring us all up to speed on the monumentally significant thing that happened Christmas Eve that affects all of us, depending on whether we participate in it or not. Now, you can file that one under teaser, okay? Now, what was this monumental event many of us missed while we were having Christmas Eve dinner, opening up a few Christmas Eve presents, attending the various Christmas Eve masses? Well, here's the backstory. There are 4 major basilicas in and around Rome. The most famous one being St. Peter's. Well, on December 24th, 2024, Christmas Eve, our current Pope, Pope Francis, well, let me back up a little bit. Each of these 4 basilicas have a door that is permanently sealed, shut. And it's only opened on this particular occasion. And this particular occasion happens roughly 3 or 4 times in anyone's lifetime. And on December 24th, at St. Peter's Basilica, Pope Francis had this door, and it's called the Holy Door, unsealed, and he walked through it. He crossed the threshold of the Holy Door. That's the monumental event that happened Christmas Eve that many of us may have missed. And again, if you're thinking, Charles, okay, so the Pope unsealed a door that's sealed shut and walked through it. That's the monumental event. That's something so significant that it only happens a couple of times in a person's lifetime. You might be a little underwhelmed. You might say, okay, but who cares? Or okay, but so what? Or okay, but how does this affect me? Well, who cares? We all should. So what? A big what? How does that affect me? It affects me in the most profoundly significant way anything can affect me, and that is my potential eternal salvation. Because when Pope Francis had that holy door unsealed at St. Peter's Basilica and crossed the threshold, he announced that the year 2025 would be a Jubilee year. And in a Jubilee year, unbelievable graces are made available to us if we determine to participate in this. So that's what happened December 24th, Christmas Eve. From that day, December 24th, all the way to January 6th of 2026, the Feast of the Epiphany. In other words, all of 2025 has been declared officially as a Jubilee year. That is the event that Pope Francis established Christmas Eve, December 24th, 2024. And in this this 2-episode one-off, I'm going to explore 2 things. Number 1, we want to establish that this is not another case of, as oftentimes Catholics are accused of, and you've probably heard it, where the Catholic Church has made something up out of thin air. There's no biblical basis for it. You can't find it in Scripture. It's another one of those Catholic things that are just made up. So in this first episode, what we want to do is establish that this whole concept of a Jubilee year is eminently biblical. And I'm going to take you through a quick journey through salvation history and through the Bible that will take us from the very roots of this Jubilee year up to that day, December 24th, that Pope Francis announced that this is one of those years. So this episode will establish the biblical basis for the Jubilee year, and then next episode we'll talk about the Jubilee year itself, the graces that are available, how we can obtain these graces, how we can enter into and participate in this Jubilee year. Because like I said, that if past is prologue, this only happens every 25 years or so. So with an average lifespan of 75 to 80 years, like I mentioned, a Jubilee year comes around really only 3 or 4 times maybe in a person's lifetime, and this year is one of those times. So we here at Fresh Catholic figured that a good rounded approach to this Jubilee year, that we go ahead and do that, so that entering into it, because it's already been going on now for a couple of months, that we know it's a Jubilee year, we know the graces that are available, we know how to obtain those graces, we know how to participate in this, because again, if past is prologue, another one of these years may not be coming around for another 25 years or so. So that's a little bit of background, a little teaser, and a little kind of preparation for what we're going to cover in each of these 2 episodes. This is episode number 1. We'll call this the biblical basis, the background, the foundation. Episode number 2 will cover the ins and outs of this particular Jubilee year 2025. So with that said, let's go ahead and let's get back into that time machine, so to speak, and let's start our journey through salvation history, through the Bible, and let's trace the roots of the very beginnings of what is to be a Jubilee year, and we'll bring it all the way up to December 24th. So let's begin at the beginning in the creation account, Genesis chapter 2. We know that God created everything out of nothing in 6 days, right? The 7th day he rested. And he rested not because he was tired, not because he was exhausted. He's God, right? He rested on the 7th day to set that 7th day apart, to bless it and to make it holy. Now, establishing that, let's move a little further forward in salvation history, a little further forward in the Bible, and let's go from Genesis to Exodus. Let's go from Genesis 2 to Exodus 20. The Israelites have been delivered out of Egypt. They've crossed the Red Sea. They've encamped at the base of Mount Sinai. Moses has gone up the mountain to speak with God, and he's given the 10 Commandments. As we know, one of those 10 Commandments, the third one, is to keep holy the Sabbath day. So what God established in the creation account, okay, the 7th day, the Sabbath day, the Israelites now at this point are commanded to keep that day holy. And how were they to do it? They were to do it no work and rest. So now we have every 7th day being a Sabbath day. So at this point in salvation history and in the Bible, Exodus, we have the Sabbath day established. Now let's move a little further forward in salvation history, a little further forward in the Bible, okay? And let's go from the Sabbath day to the Sabbath year. And now we find ourselves still in the Old Testament in the book of Leviticus, Leviticus 25, all right? And in Leviticus 25, we'll find out that part of the instructions the Israelites get at this point in time is that every 7th year is a Sabbath year. And during that Sabbath year, the land would get rest. It would lay fallow in order to kind of regenerate. So now, as far as things go, we have the Sabbath day established, and then now we have the Sabbath year established. Now let's move a little further forward still in salvation history, a little further forward still in the Bible. Let's stay in the book of Leviticus, Leviticus 25, and now let's go from the Sabbath day to the Sabbath year to the Jubilee year. Because every 7th day is a Sabbath day. We've already established that, okay? Every 7th year is a Sabbath year. We've established that. And after we go through 7 cycles of 7 years, which is 49 years, every 50th year will be kind of like a super Sabbath year. It'll be a Jubilee year. And in a Jubilee year, not only will the land rest, not only will the land lay fallow, but all slaves are freed, all debts are canceled, all property is returned to its original owner in commemoration of what God did for the Israelites back in the Exodus. Okay? So now we've got the Sabbath day, we've got the Sabbath year, and now we've got the Jubilee year. All right? At this point, we have established the basis of a Jubilee year. Now you might be saying, well, that's okay. I didn't realize that, Charles. That's kind of a nice, quick kind of tracing of its origins. But this all happened back in the Old Testament. This whole concept of a Jubilee year. Did that carry through to the New Testament? Or is it just an Old Testament thing? The answer is no, it's not an Old Testament thing. This whole concept of a Jubilee year does carry through in the New Testament. Well, if that's the case, how did it carry through? When did it carry through? Who carried it through? And in that case, now we have to move even further forward in salvation history, even further forward in the Bible. And now not only are we going to get out of the book of Leviticus, not only are we going to get out of the Old Testament, now we're going to be in the New Testament, and we're going to be at the beginning of Jesus' public ministry. Because it was Jesus that continued this whole concept of a Jubilee year from the Old Testament to the New Testament. So now let's move further forward, and now let's go into the Gospel of Luke, specifically Luke chapter 4, where we'll find Jesus in his hometown of Nazareth. It's the Sabbath, so being a devout Jew, he is in the synagogue. And he is the one that's going to be reading and teaching this day in the synagogue. In fact, you might say this is Jesus's first sermon of his public ministry. So let's kind of peek into the window of that synagogue in Nazareth on that Sabbath day at the very beginning of Jesus's public ministry, and let's see how he establishes the fact that the concept of the Jubilee year established in the Old Testament isn't just an Old Testament thing, it's carried through into the New Testament. So let's peek into the window of that synagogue, okay? Now, what would we see, what would we hear? Well, Jesus, at a certain point in the synagogue service, Jesus stood up. He was handed a scroll from the prophet Isaiah. He unrolls the scroll and specifically finds a particular passage. So what Jesus reads on that day in that synagogue from the prophet Isaiah is not something he happened to stumble on. It was something he particularly looked for and found out. Okay, so he unrolls the scroll, he searches through it till he gets to this passage, okay, and he reads. Now, how does Luke record this in chapter 4 of his gospel? This is how Luke records it. He, Jesus, came to Nazareth where he had grown up, and went, according to his custom, into the synagogue on the Sabbath day. He stood up to read and was handed a scroll of the prophet Isaiah. He unrolled the scroll and found the passage where it was written. So this is Jesus reading from the scroll of the prophet Isaiah. This is what Jesus is reading. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring glad tidings to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim a year acceptable to the Lord. Then Luke records, he rolled up the scroll, he handed it back to the attendant, and sat down, and the eyes of all in the synagogue looked intently at him. He said to them, "Today this scripture passage is fulfilled in your hearing." Now let me reread again what Jesus read from the prophet Isaiah, okay? Because once we read it again, the question is going to come up, well, where in this particular reading does Jesus carry this concept of the Jubilee year established in the Old Testament into the New Testament? Let me go ahead and reread what Jesus said, and then we'll pinpoint it. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring glad tidings to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim a year acceptable to the Lord. Now, somewhere in that passage from Isaiah, Jesus brings this Old Testament concept of Jubilee year into the New Testament. And where he does it is in the very last line. To proclaim a year acceptable to the Lord. A year acceptable to the Lord. What is this year that Jesus is talking about? The Jubilee year. And then when he rolls up the scroll and sits down and says, today this passage is fulfilled in your hearing, this year acceptable to the Lord, this Jubilee year, okay, has now been brought forward into the New Testament, okay? So now we've got, if you're tracking along, we've established a Sabbath day in Genesis. We've established a Sabbath year. We've established a Sabbath day in Genesis. We've established the Israelites to keep holy that Sabbath day in Exodus. We've established a Sabbath year in Leviticus. We've established the Jubilee year in Leviticus. And now we move out of the Old Testament into the New Testament, into Jesus' public ministry. And Jesus indicates that this concept of the year acceptable to the Lord, this concept of a Jubilee year, is not being left in the Old Testament. It's not part of the Old Covenant. It's being brought forward into the New Testament, into the New Covenant. So Jesus himself continues it on. Now, let's continue our journey, all right? Now, let's move from that synagogue in Nazareth on that Sabbath day in the beginning of Jesus' public ministry in 33 A.D. Now let's move even further forward in salvation history, okay? And let's move from 33 A.D. to 1299 A.D., where we find the current Pope, Pope Boniface. And he's in Rome, he's in the Vatican, and he's noticing something curious. He's noticed that during this whole year, 1299 AD, that inordinate numbers of pilgrims are coming to Rome, are coming to the Vatican, more than normal. So he wants to, he's curious, he wants to find out why, okay? He's told that, this is 1299 AD, the next year will be 1300 AD, and a lot of the faithful want to begin this new year, 1300 AD. They want to begin it with the blessings of God and the protection of the apostles. So they're pilgrimaging to Rome, to get that blessing and get that protection, because they want to go into 1300 AD, okay? Now, why were they so concerned about, going into this 1300 AD this next year with as many blessings of God as they could, the protection of the apostles? Well, if we know our history, they've been through a lot the previous years. They've been through the Black Plague, a pandemic. Oh, that sounds familiar. They've been through a war. That sounds familiar too. They've been through financial hardship. That sounds familiar. They've undergone through a lot of social upheaval. That's familiar. So in the midst of all that they've been experiencing, they want to go into 1300 AD, this new year, with as many blessings from God as they could and from as much protection from the apostles as they could. So they've pilgrimaged to Rome, okay? So when Pope Boniface finds this out, he says, okay, what I'm going to do is then I'm going to declare this next year, this new year, 1300 AD, I'm going to declare it a Jubilee year. So all the blessings and graces and mercy these people are seeking can be poured out lavishly. I'm going to declare 1300 AD as a Jubilee year. So now we've brought this whole concept of a Jubilee year up to 1300 AD, right? And it's been part of Catholic tradition ever since, that every so often the Pope will declare, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, a year to be a Jubilee year, a year where graces and blessings and mercy are poured out even more abundantly than ever before. It's been part of Catholic tradition basically since the 1300 AD, since Pope Boniface declared that year a Jubilee year. And for a while from that point, a Jubilee year would be announced every 50 years. Then after a while, it was announced every 25 years or so. That's why I said at the beginning of this that if you look back, every 25 years or so is a Jubilee year, with an average lifespan of an individual being 75, 80 years, an individual may only have the opportunity to participate in 3, maybe 4 Jubilee years in his or her lifetime. And as of December 24th, Christmas Eve, we're in one of those years. 2025 is the most recent Jubilee year. So, if you've been tracking along, again, a review. We've established a Sabbath day. We've established a Sabbath year. We've established a Jubilee year, all in the Old Testament. Jesus brings that Jubilee year, that year acceptable to the Lord, into the New Testament. We've then gone and traced it to Pope Boniface in 1300 AD, where every 25 to 50 years or so, it's been part of Catholic tradition ever since. Jubilee year 2025 is the most recent version of it. Okay? So clearly, and again, you know, in this journey through salvation history, we're kind of water skiing across the surface and we're not necessarily deep sea diving, but clearly you can see this whole concept of a Jubilee year is not, quote, another one of those things you Catholics make up out of thin air, okay? We can trace its roots, its growth, all through salvation history, all through the Bible, up to the current day and time with Pope Francis. So that is a very quick journey through the establishment of the Jubilee year, from its roots in the Sabbath day to the Sabbath year to the Jubilee year, all the way up to the current time. Okay? Now, let's continue our journey, okay? Because now, all right, let's go back a little bit. And we can't really talk about this whole concept of a Jubilee year without talking about the great Pope St. John Paul II. Because in many ways, he tailored his whole pontificate as a Jubilee type pontificate, okay? Because, you know, his view was he wanted to lead the church into the new millennium. Now remember, he was elected Pope in 1978. So from that point on, he wanted to lead the church into the new millennium, okay? And if you go back through his pontificate, he couched a lot of his language in Jubilee type language, okay? Again, he said that he viewed his mission was to lead the church across the threshold of the new millennium. Now that word threshold that he would often use, he used it when he said, my mission is to lead the church across the threshold of the new millennium. His first homily as Pope He encouraged the people to throw open wide the doors of Christ. And he even wrote a best-selling book, Crossing the Threshold of Hope. His language was peppered with the word doors and threshold. Now, why do I bring that up? Well, let's go back to the teaser I gave you at the beginning of this episode, where Pope Francis on Christmas Eve, unsealed the holy door and crossed the threshold of it. So Jubilees are all about holy doors and crossing thresholds. So when John Paul II, said his mission was to lead the church across the threshold of the new millennium, when he encouraged people to throw open wide the doors of Christ, when he writes a book called Crossing the Threshold of Hope, he's using Jubilee-type language because his pontificate was very much a Jubilee-type pontificate. So we want to make mention of that as well. Now, let's bring us, again, coming full circle, to Christmas Eve, 2024, all right? Did Pope Francis all of a sudden wake up Christmas Eve morning and say, you know something? I'm going to have the holy door at St. Peter's Basilica unsealed, and I'm going to cross the threshold, and I'm going to announce that 2025 is going to be a Jubilee year. Did he just wake up Christmas Eve morning and decide to do that apropos of nothing? No, because if we go back to February of 2022, Pope Francis actually announced that December 24th, 2024 is going to be the next Jubilee year. So 2 years prior to this, Pope Francis announced what he was going to do on Christmas Eve. So it wasn't something that just came to him Christmas Eve morning. It wasn't just something he came up with out of the blue. He had previously announced it so the church could get ready for it, could anticipate. And then, of course, on Christmas Eve, 2024, he did just that. He walked through the holy door, he crossed the threshold, and from that moment until January 6, 2026, the Feast of the Epiphany, basically from that moment all through 2025, we have now been in the latest edition, if you want to speak, of the Jubilee year. Now, if at this point you're saying, well, you know, this is very interesting, Charles, I had no idea. Thanks for the background. Thanks for the little history lesson. I can see the Catholic Church doesn't just make it up, that you've traced kind of the origins and the growth of it to its present day. So I understand that. But again, you might be saying, still though, you know, you seem really geeked up about this Jubilee year and how great it is and how significant it is. But maybe you're saying on the other side of the camera there, you know, I'm still not feeling it. Okay, we're in a Jubilee year. Supposedly graces and mercy and blessings are flowing like never before. And this is a rare opportunity that happens only 3 or 4 times in a person's lifetime. Yeah, I get that you're excited about it, Charles, but you might be saying, I'm still not feeling it, okay? Exactly what kind of graces are available, and what blessings are available, and what mercy is available, and how do I go about obtaining it, and how this has all happened, how this has all work, okay? Because again, we have to remind ourselves, okay, of something we know theologically and something I've mentioned in previous theology courses I've taught, both live and at Fresh Catholic. And that is that if we want to enter and live the life of heaven, which I assume we all do, okay, because the life of heaven is different than life on earth, we have to be equipped to enter and live in heaven. And if you've been following any of these courses that I've done, you know the analogy I like to use is the analogy of the spacesuit, okay? And again, let me bring it up real quickly here. If I want to enter and live in outer space, I have to have the proper equipment. That proper equipment comes in the form of a spacesuit. So if I want any hope of entering and living in outer space, I have to have that spacesuit. It's a matter of fact. That's the reality. I cannot enter and live in outer space dressed the way I am. All right? I have to be equipped because life in outer space is different than life on Earth. It's just a fact. If I'm equipped, if I have that spacesuit, I can enter and live the life of outer space. If I don't, I can't. Well, now let's move that into the spiritual realm. In order to enter and live the life of heaven, I have to be equipped. Now, my equipment doesn't come in the form of a spacesuit, obviously. What equips me to enter and live the life of heaven is I have to have sanctifying grace in my soul. My soul has to be equipped to live the heavenly life. And its equipment, so to speak, is sanctifying grace. If I die in a state of sanctifying grace, I can enter and live the life of heaven. If I die not in the state of sanctifying grace, if I die in a state of unconfessed mortal sin, I can't. So just like I need a spacesuit to enter and live in heaven, I need sanctifying grace in my soul to enter and, did I say that right? In order to enter and live the life of outer space, I need a spacesuit. In order to enter and live the life of heaven, I need sanctifying grace in my soul. It's just, that's the reality. It's the way it is, all right? So I want as much sanctifying grace in my soul as I can get. And there is, in a Jubilee year, the amount of graces that are available to us are at an all-time high, okay? So if I'm looking to get as much sanctifying grace in my soul as I possibly can, the Jubilee year is the best year to get that. Now again, I can obtain sanctifying grace at any point, any day, any week, any month of any year, right? But the concentration of it, if I can say that, is never greater than in a Jubilee year. Okay, which is what we've been in since December 24th. So that's why I'm so geeked up about it, and that's why all of us should be so geeked up about it, because what we need to enter and live the life of heaven, sanctifying grace, is at no time is it poured out more abundantly than in a Jubilee year. And we're in one of those this year, and we might not be in one for another 25 years. Now, speaking personally, I'm 68 years of age, okay? Statistically, this is my last Jubilee year, unless I live a very lengthy life, okay? But none of us know when our last day on earth is going to be, okay? For many of us, this might be our last Jubilee year, whatever age we are. So we want to know what a Jubilee year is. First we want to establish it is biblical, which we've done. We want to, and then we want to find out, what graces are available, how they're available, and how we obtain as much of them as we can. And that's why we're delivering this 2-episode one-off on the Jubilee year 2025 here at Fresh Catholic. So at this point, okay, what graces are available? How do we obtain them? How do we appropriate them into our souls? That's what we'll talk about in our next episode of this 2-episode one-off. So as we close this episode, hopefully in a rather quick fashion, I've traced the origins of the Jubilee year and how it's grown through the Old Testament into the New Testament up to the current time. And we've established why this whole concept of a Jubilee year is so significant and so profound for us. Hopefully that's in place. So when we see each other again, episode number 2, we'll talk about the nuts and bolts of Jubilee year 2025. So with that, until next time, as always, thank you for supporting Fresh Catholic. I'm Charles Merritt. Take care and God bless.